Yeah, I'm excited about today. You sent me like beforehand, here's some info so we don't look stupid. And then I started reading. I'm like, well, if I'm going to look stupid.
What's up, everybody? It is episode 235 of Bourbon Pursuit, and this week we are back in action, yet again talking about bourbon. But before we do that, we do have some news to cover. Now, we already know that the trade war, it's going pretty strong, and bourbon has been hit, and there's no telling if that is ever going to end. But now, there's a new target in sight as part of a retaliation effort, and we're looking at wine, or sort of say more specifically European wine and other kind of European whiskeys. So there is currently a looming trade tariff of up to 100% that would affect all European Union countries selling wine and other spirits to the United States. Now, wine in general is imported as a $20 billion a year industry here in the States. And this follows already an existing round of 25% tariffs that have been levied back in October against Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. American wine drinkers would be faced with fewer wines coming to America from the EU, especially those made by small independent producers, and you can expect higher prices on those bottles that do make it in. For those that make a livelihood in the wine trade, the mood is less than stellar. Importers, distributors, wine shop owners, sommeliers, and grocery store wine buyers said that they fear they would have to impose salary or staffing cuts as a result of dramatically reduced profit margins. Now, you might think that this would be good for domestic wine producers like those in California that make up 95% of the U.S. wine market. However, the Wine Institute has spoken out against the tariffs, arguing that the EU could just as easily turn around and target U.S. wines in a tit-for-tat trade war. As much as California vendors want to serve up their wine for domestic consumers, Europe is still their most important export market, bringing in around $469 million in 2018. And you can find the links to these two articles from the LA Times and QZ.com with the link in our show notes. The Tennessee ABC has issued cease and desist orders from out-of-state businesses who have been doing direct-to-consumer shipments of alcohol. Now, we talk about shipping alcohol all the time on the podcast, and this one is kind of rolling things back in a negative way. As a quote, wine is the only alcoholic beverage that can be legally shipped direct to consumers in Tennessee, and it requires a winery direct shipper's license issued by the commission, and this is coming from the Tennessee ABC director, Russell Thomas. The Tennessee ABC recently discovered the illegal shipments after analyzing common carrier reports compiled by the Tennessee Department of Revenue. It requires common carriers to file alcohol delivery reports to the Department of Revenue each month, and it also requires that any business that sells and ships wine direct to Tennessee has to be licensed as well. In other news, the Scottish government is trying to tackle booze-related criminals, and they have given the green light to remote alcohol monitoring and sobriety tags after awarding a multi-million-pound security firm contract. The anti-booze ankle tags can detect if you've consumed alcohol by monitoring the sweat every 30 minutes from your pores. But ministers are still in talks about handling Scottish courts the power to force these criminals whose convictions are linked to alcohol to actually wear these tags. If this goes ahead, then they could be forced to go alcohol-free for months to tackle the drinking problem which contributed to their crimes. You can find the link to the Scottish Sun within our show notes. All right, so you ready to geek out? And I mean like super bourbon geek out. I heard about our guest today, Tom Collins, after I learned he gave an in-depth talk at Tales. It intrigued me to know more about the science behind bourbon. Tom has dedicated part of his career to the details of alcohol, and for us, it's looking at the chemical composition of bourbon as well as the chemical influence from the barrels as well. We examine at a scientific level what certain char levels create, how entry proof affects it, and how bourbon and rye are different from their molecular makeup. Like I said, get ready to geek out. But now, let's go ahead, take a break. We're going to hear from Fred Minnick with Above the Char.
I'm Fred Minnick, and this is Above the Char. This week's idea comes from Kyleman on Twitter, or at Bourbon Numbers. On January 2nd, he wrote me and said, "Does making a career out of your hobby ever diminish the fun or actually deepen the experience? Do you have a hobby you would not go pro for that reason?" Thanks. That's a great question, Kyle Mann. And I actually do have quite a bit of experience with this. See, I initially started my career as a sports writer. Well, professionally, I did. So my career starts as like an ag journalist where I was covering crops and cattle futures and things like that. But I always wanted to be a sports writer because I was a huge sports junkie. I get into sports, in high school. I start writing about, local football games, track, baseball. I would also write about anything that anybody would let me write about, to be honest with you. But I get to college and I start writing about sports, and I take a job with the Daily Oklahoman. I'm on the sports desk there, and I'm writing the headlines for the Daily Oklahoman. And I start interviewing athletes and coaches, and there was one thing that was pretty common. It did not matter the level or the sport. Coaches did not treat reporters with the same respect that they did colleagues or their players or parents even. And the players kind of followed the leadership of their coaches. And for the most part, reporters get treated like crap in the sports business. And you don't have to look any further than a Bill Parcells or Bill Belichick press conference to see what I'm talking about. They often come with a very much a disdain toward reporters. And I was coming at it from a fan's perspective. And I didn't necessarily like the way that sports, the kind of avenue I would have to go down in order to continue a career in sports. Because as I was covering them, I felt the fan being ripped away from me. I didn't enjoy that. To be honest with you, I enjoyed being a fan far more than I did covering sports. Now, fast forward to my bourbon career. I start writing about bourbon in 2006 and 2007 and get really serious about it between 2010 and 2012. And I kind of start in a period in which people weren't really writing about bourbon on a professional level. You did have some bloggers and you had a couple magazine writers, but there was not a lot of us. And to this day, there aren't that many professional whiskey writers. But back then, there were not the proliferation of blogs. The social media wasn't around, and distillers were just happy to get attention from anybody, really. And the consumer base were all about people who would crack open this kind of a mythical bourbon egg and shine the light upon some of the secrecy. And that was kind of what I was doing. And so I found myself in a place where both the consumer base and the distiller base were very excited to see any kind of writing I was doing. And while that has certainly changed, my passion for bourbon has not. The one thing that has changed in bourbon, and it's nothing like it was in sports, you tend to have a lot of people who enter this space and want to make a career out of it, or they want to cash in on bourbon while it's big. And those people tend to go away because they don't have the passion for American whiskey like many of us do. And they just see American whiskey as another check. And I think right now we're seeing a lot of those kinds of people come and go. And those who have the passion, those who want to see this, through the end and enjoy it for the rest of our lifetime, you're going to see us around for a long, long time, even when whiskey's not popular anymore. And that's this week's Above the Char. Hey, if you're interested in getting a career in American whiskey, there's all kinds of avenues open for you. You can even find some places to go to school to learn more about it. I think Kenny's got a few ideas he'd like to share with you. And that's this week's Above the Char. Hit me up on Twitter or Instagram if you ever want to connect. Until next week, cheers.
Do you ever pour yourself a bourbon, swirl it around, and then start struggling to come up with tasting notes? And perhaps you're also looking for a good Father's Day gift idea. Well, you can now solve both with a kit from Knows Your Bourbon. And unlike other nosing kits on the market, Knows Your Bourbon kits feature real ingredients for the most authentic aromas. You can smell real Tahitian vanilla bean instead of some synthetic aroma that's just made from chemicals. So head on over to knowsyourbourbon.com and enter code BP10 for 10% off your order. Ed Bly and Rising Tide Spirits are back again with a new release of Old Stubborn Bourbon.
And this release of Old Stubborn is a premium hand marriage of 10, 11, and 12-year cask strength, barely filtered pot still bourbon. It comes in at a staggering 123.8 proof, and the flavoring grain for this one, which the last one was wheated, but this time it's now rye. Rich, sweet, and bold with a long finish that's sure to be another eye-opener. You can order online at Sealbox or thebourbonconcierge.com, and you can even purchase in person at Revival Vintage Spirits, and even now with very few select stores in Kentucky. You can get it now while you can, but be sure to do it because it's not going to last long. From their bar to yours, Chad and Sarah of the popular YouTube channel It's Bourbon Night bring you their favorite at-home old-fashioned mix with the new Elemental Elixir's Golden Hour Syrup. It's a custom-made syrup with notes of bold black tea, warm spices, and orange zest. All you need is your favorite whiskey and ice. No bitters needed. One bottle makes 16 drinks, so that's only $1 a cocktail before you add your own whiskey. They can also be enjoyed in other cocktails or spirits, mocktails, coffee, tea, and anything you can think of. It's crafted locally in Lexington, Kentucky, and you can get your bottle now at whiskeyambitions.com.
Play Whiskey Wednesday, Round 11, the memory game. Until June 26, each week you can win one of our 12 incredible grand prizes. Select 2 doors at checkout, and if they match on drawing night, you'll win that bottle. Not a match? No worries. You still score a Weller 12-year. Every $5 ticket gives you 5 chances to win, including 4 weekly bonus prizes. Get your tickets now at give270.org. Charitable Gaming License ORG 0002703.
Always find what you love at Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from at the lowest price, it's easy to find your favorite Cabernet or a new single-barrel bourbon to try with some help from one of their friendly guides. And with every bottle comes the confidence of knowing you just found something amazing. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, find what you love and love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly and be 21.
Welcome back to another episode of Bourbon Pursuit, the official podcast of bourbon. Kenny and Ryan here tonight. We are, well, during the day, I don't know, you might be driving right now, but we're recording this at night. And this is going to be something that like, I'm going to really, really enjoy because especially anybody out there that has had any background in science or chemistry, we're about to geek out here.
Yes. Yeah, I think the last time we really geeked out was when we were talking yeast and like with Pat Heist, and then from Wilderness Trail, we kind of went, well, I did anyways, like went down this rabbit hole of like all these crazy spore talk and all this stuff that's way over a lot of people's head. But yeah, I'm excited about today. You sent me like beforehand, here's some info so we don't look stupid. And then I started reading. I'm like, well, if I'm going to look stupid.
And, we were kind of talking about the very beginning. Our guest today sent over some abstracts or some scientific papers that he had helped publish and stuff like that. And one of them, I'll just kind of read the title, was called Profiling of Non-Volatiles in Whiskey Using Ultra High Pressure Liquid Chromatography Quadruple the Time of Flight Mass Spectrometry. That was the title. And I was just like mind blown here. Right.
And I started reading through it, and then I have a horticulture degree with Turfman. Like I remember having to take organic chemistry, and like I barely passed it. And this reminded me of a lot of it. So this is bringing me like bad memories of like failing at life in school. And so hopefully Tom will be easy on us.
Yeah. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and introduce our guest today. So today on the show, we have Dr. Thomas Collins. He is is an assistant professor at Washington State University in the viticulture and enology program at Washington State. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Oh, welcome. Hi. Thanks for the invite. I'm looking forward to this conversation. This should be fun.
Absolutely. Did I stumble on your the program that you're in there?
No, I think you got it right. Viticulture and enology.
All right, cool. I didn't butcher it too bad. So for our people that want to know more about even what that is, explain even what viticulture and enology is to our listeners out there.
So viticulture is the science of grape growing. Vitis is the species for grapes. So viticulture is just the study of grape growing. And then enology is the study of winemaking. So my background is I'm a chemist, and I do work in aroma and flavor chemistry of grapes, wines, and distilled spirits.
Nice.
Yeah. So how'd you choose that path? If I had a chemistry degree and had any field to choose, that would probably be it. But how did you get involved with that?
Well, I think you're on the right track there. If you're going to do this sort of thing, it's important to study something you're going to enjoy studying, right? So there's lots of areas of science you can go into, and some of them I wonder how people get involved. But I think studying grapes and wine and spirits seems like an area that would be enjoyable. You're going to have samples to work with and samples to do all kinds of sensory evaluation.
For research, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All for research, all in the name of science.
I'm surprised you don't have a plaque behind you that says that or something like that, or just a banner that says just for science here.
Yeah, well, the license plate holder on my car says life is too short to make bad wine. So
Nice.
And so I guess kind of talk about, because I know you do a lot of stuff with wine now, but I know that, we had originally reached out to you because I saw it. You had done a presentation at Tales of the Cocktails a few years ago. And It was really, I said, like, there's got to be somebody out there that really knows like the chemistry behind bourbon. And so you had kind of been doing that. So kind of talk about your research over the years and kind of what you've been focused on in that category.
So I guess how I ended up here was I worked for a big wine company in California, and I worked with them while I was doing my PhD at University of California at Davis. And the focus of my research at that time was on oak aroma and flavor chemistry, because the winery I worked for owned a cooperage. So they had a company that was making barrels for them. And the focus was really trying to understand how the coopering or barrel making process affects the outcome of the barrel, what the chemistry of the barrel looks like, and then ultimately the chemistry of the wine that's aged in those barrels. And so that was my PhD project, was really just trying to understand how what happens in the cooperage affects what happens to the barrel, and then what happens to the wine stored in it. The next step is to look at, or one of the next steps in my research development was, all right, so that's what happens when you put wine in a barrel and it's 15% alcohol. What happens if you then look at a different beverage, a different product? What happens if we put whiskey in that barrel instead? Now we're talking, instead of 15% alcohol, where it's 65% alcohol. You're going to extract different things. The barrels are made in a different way. So it just was sort of a logical extension to the research I had already done. And also gets me into working in distilled spirits, an area that I enjoy personally. And here's an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how things are different with spirits compared to wine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is cool. And so I guess let's kind of go into that topic a little bit, right? I mean, I think the first one that you kind of mentioned was the oak and the wood and stuff like that. Kind of talk about some of your research that you did in regards of really what because I think there was one paper you had also written called Targeted Volatile Composition of Oak Wood Samples Taken During Toasting at a Commercial Cooperage. So kind of let's talk about really what the goal or the thesis of this was, and then kind of like the results and really where you came out of this.
Well, from a practical standpoint, the question we were trying to answer with the initial research when I still worked with the winery was, the company owns this cooperage, so it gives us an opportunity as a company to have barrels made exactly the way we would like them to be made, rather than buying barrels that someone else has made and decided how they wanted to do the toasting. This was an opportunity for winemakers to talk directly to the coopers and say, this is what I'm looking for in a barrel, and have the coopers make them for that. It sounds like a great prospect, but it turns out it's hard. You need a translator between what winemakers say they're looking for and what coopers can actually do. So if the winemaker says, I want a certain kind of tannin, or I want a certain aroma and flavor profile, there has to be some translation for the cooper to understand what they're looking for and how winemaker speak sort of translates into something that they can do in the cooperage to achieve that goal. And so that's where the genesis for this research project was really just trying to understand, if winemakers are looking for a certain thing, what do the coopers have to do to achieve that? And that morphed into really just trying to understand, how does the whole process of toasting barrels work? And what are the key factors in terms of where the wood originates from, how it's seasoned, how you're going to toast it to get to a certain aroma and flavor profile that the winemakers might look for. And so that's where you get these studies where we're looking at volatile profiles changing during the toasting process, because we're trying to understand what components are being generated as you heat the barrel, as you toast it, and how they change throughout the toasting process. So it turns out many of the things that we associated with toasted oak in terms of the aromas of vanilla and clove and the spicy aromas and sort of the things that we're looking for from our barrels, most of those are produced during the toasting process. They're not present in the untoasted wood.
What are some of those things that you're looking for?
So the actual compounds. So
yeah, get nerdy on us.
Yeah, we'll go down that road. Well, the first one is vanillin, which is not surprising, the one that smells like vanilla. But we're also looking at things like eugenol and isoeugenol, which have clove-type aromas. Eugenol is the primary compound in cloves. We're looking at furfurols, which come from degradation of sugars during the toasting process. So the cellulose and hemicellulose that compose the structure of the wood in part, when that's heated, you get thermal breakdown that results in the formation of furfurol kinds of compounds that give you these toasty aromas. Another structural polymer in wood is lignin. And when you break that down by heating it, you get things like, you get vanillin for one, you get guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol, which are related, which are the related to the whiskey lactones. They're the kinds of aromas that give you spicy or medicinal characters, depending on their concentrations and which ones you get. So there are a number, we looked at about a dozen different compounds and looked at how they're produced throughout the toasting process. So we put thermocouples into the staves before the barrels were toasted, so we could measure the temperature of the wood throughout the process. And then we took samples at regular intervals during the process and took that back to the lab for the analysis. And so while the barrels are being toasted, we're monitoring the temperature, we're collecting samples of the wood, and then we can do the analysis to figure out how things change throughout the toasting process. These compounds aren't all produced at the same time at the same rate. So some of them take more heat to generate, and so they tend to develop later in the toasting process. Some things are produced very quickly, but if you have too much heat, then they get degraded, broken down into other compounds, or they just volatilize and disappear. And so depending on what the winemaker is looking for, you might want to toast the barrel for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time. You might do a high temperature, short time toasting to emphasize things that are produced quickly, or you might do a slower, low heat toasting protocol to produce things that take more heat to generate. And so by doing this kind of study, we could start to understand how to tailor the toasting process at the cooperage to get the specific aroma compounds that the winemakers were looking for.
Interesting.
So with how do you control, I guess, the variables, because you have wood, which is a living thing. I'm just thinking of like turf research, and like you kind of have like a lot of uncontrollable variables because you are dealing with a living thing or was living. And so are there times that you have like you said, we're toasting exactly the same with the exact same type of wood, and it doesn't translate like it did in the lab, out in the real world.
Right. Well, and you really kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the problem with the toasting process generally is there's not a lot of control in terms of how that happens. So the coopers all have a protocol. They're supposed to use this many fires, and they're supposed to be on each fire for this amount of time. But one of the things we saw in this process is that there's a lot of variability just in how the individual coopers manage their fires. And so at this particular cooperage, there were 2 different coopers that did the toasting, and they didn't manage their fires quite the same, and their barrels were different. Even though they're following the same protocol, the same number of fires for the same amount of time, getting the intensity of the fire to be consistent is one of the things that you have to do well to get a consistent outcome. And that's fairly difficult to do. And so who's really on top of that can do a better job. But if the two coopers are not doing it quite the same, then you end up with barrels that look different. We could tell from the chemical analysis which cooper made which barrels.
Really interesting. It just makes it like with whiskey, like you do single barrel picks and you have sister barrels on the same exact row, like honey barrels that just taste like significantly different than one that's like right next to it. Sure. I wonder if those variables in the toasting, even though they're theoretically at the same char or whatever, protocol, that, like you said, there's so many different variables that it's hard to like pin that down, I guess.
That's exactly right. And we saw the same thing you see the same thing in winemaking. If you taste wine from 20 different barrels that are all made same day, same cooperage, same wood, same forest, you have all those variables controlled, you still see variability in the outcome. And it's because, to a great extent, it's because of this variation in the toasting process that it's really hard to get that well controlled. And most cooperages don't necessarily have a lot of instrumentation that says this is what the temperature is of the wood at this point. It's not easy to put that kind of instrumentation in place, and most of them don't have it. And they're relying on the experience of the cooper to come up with something that's consistent. But it is a really difficult job to get that level of consistency day in and day out. I mean, one of the things we looked at is over a 4-day period, how consistent were the barrels from one day to the next, to the next, to the next. And there were definitely good days and bad days in terms of consistency.
I'm kind of looking at some of the data here, and you have some graphs that basically show the type of oak, the type of toast, and then you have like the level of vanillin in regards of like what degrees Celsius was the I'm assuming it was either the temperature or was the wood at that time. So you can kind of you can't actually calculate what's at what temperature you're trying to pull out the most of that particular compound.
Right. So we looked at about a dozen different compounds, and we measured the temperature throughout the process. And so we could start to say, when we get to this kind of temperature, we're going to see formation of these compounds. And as it progresses, certain compounds like guaiacol, for example, the longer you heat it, the hotter it gets, the more guaiacol you get. But things like vanillin, there's some there in the untoasted wood. It gets produced fairly early in the process, but as you continue to heat the barrel, it drops off. It's being converted into something else, or it's just escaping. And so the goal of that was really to try and understand what temperature protocols you want to follow if you want to emphasize vanillin, for example, rather than guaiacol. So if you want something that has more of those vanillin characters, how would you achieve that? Whereas if you want something that's toasty, smoky, and has a lot of guaiacol, you just keep toasting it, and the hotter you go, the more of it you get. So those particular plots were really critical to trying to work with the coopers to understand what they needed to do to make specific profiles.
So what's the outcome here? Kind of what you were trying to get, or what was like the general data? Like, what did it really say to you?
Well, so I guess the most important takeaway message from that whole study was there's a lot of variability in this process. And until coopers really focus on getting consistent toasting protocols, getting that part of the process down, all the discussion that we have in the wine industry about the oak coming from French forests, whether it's wide grain oak or tight grain oak, or it comes from this forest versus that forest, all of that stuff really doesn't matter if the cooper doesn't have a way to toast the barrels consistently. So what we saw was the variability in the toasting process sort of trumped everything else, because until you could get that more consistent, you couldn't see differences between tight grain and open grain. You couldn't see differences between this forest and that. It was really more about how the barrels were toasted. So that was the first thing, was the cooperage really needed to focus more on getting the coopers to be consistent in toasting. The second thing was, if you can do that, then you have the possibility of making barrels that have specific flavor profiles by adjusting how you do the toasting to focus on vanillin or to focus on guaiacol. These things all have distinct curves for when they're produced and when they're degraded. And so you can start to adjust how you make the barrels to focus on one flavor profile over another. So that was an important key. And then the other thing that came out of the overall process was, as a wine company, we knew a whole lot more about how to assess barrels, how to make decisions about the composition of barrels and how that might interact with the wine that we were trying to make. And so we could give the winemakers a lot of information about barrel selection that I think allowed them to do some more interesting things with their barrels than they would have been otherwise. It's always good to have good information about the tools that you're using. And this study did a good job of helping the winemakers better understand the contribution of oak in their wine profiles.
There's cooperages out there that not all of them toast their barrels, right? So I guess this is also showing that, there is scientific research and study here that you can figure out that you can pull more of those types of compounds that you want by toasting it as well.
Yep. And I think, just to jump ahead a little bit, I think there may be some information from this toasting study that could be beneficial for distilleries that are starting to move or are interested in moving into these barrels that are toasted and then charred, because you're going to use charred barrels, generally speaking, for bourbon, but there is a move, at least in part, towards doing some toasting the barrel first before you char it. Mm-hmm. And I think the potential benefit there is, below the char layer, you're going to have the opportunity to affect the composition of that toasted layer underneath the char. So you may be able to get slightly different profiles from this than you would with just a straight charred barrel.
There you go.
I want you to, how can a buttery taste out of a barrel? So like a Chardonnay, for instance, is, real buttery, or like we've had a couple single barrel picks where we taste like, it tastes like real buttery or oily. What chemical compound is that coming from?
Well, when we talk about Chardonnay and the butter in Chardonnay, that often comes from the malolactic fermentation. So it's actually a microbial, a lactic acid bacteria metabolite. Diacetyl is one of the compounds that is most associated with that character in Chardonnay. And certain barrels may enhance that for a couple of reasons. One is some barrels may produce better conditions for the bacteria to do their thing. We do see a fair amount of oak sugars that are released during the toasting process, and so it may make it more conducive for some of these organisms to thrive. Those compounds in whiskey may be something that comes from the fermentation of the mash and gets carried over during the distillation. So
gotcha.
You could have similar organisms producing diacetyl and related compounds during the fermentation. So I'm not sure if it's barrel related, but that would be in wine. It's usually a lactic acid bacteria from the malolactic fermentation that's making those kinds of characters.
All right, Ryan, you got that written down?
The more you know.
So let's talk about bourbon and whiskey in itself. Kind of break us down here and really school us, like what's like a chemical composition or a makeup of really what this looks like, and kind of point me to one of these articles you've written too that can help me also better understand it.
Well, so the transition to looking at spirits came from just wanting to continue to work with oak and try to understand how oak composition affects not just wine, but let's look at other products as well. And so we started looking into just what's in different kinds of spirits. And so we looked at not just bourbon, but other whiskeys as well. So in one of the profiling, work, we looked at how do bourbons and scotches and Irish whiskeys and other whiskeys compare to one another. And some of the differences there have to do with new oak versus oak that's already barrels that have already been used to age bourbon or other products. And then one of the other questions that sort of came along that started the work that I've been doing with Jake Lon at Virginia Tech has been just this question of what's the difference between bourbon and rye whiskeys, and can we differentiate them? So I guess to break it down is mash bill. Can we see differences in mash bill through the oak that we're using to age the whiskeys in?
Kind of start at the top right there. Like, can you discern the types of whiskeys by the mash bill after it's been created from a chemical way to do it, and kind of talk about the process of like how you came to your conclusion too?
So it started with just a small study where we just went to the local liquor store and picked up a dozen bourbons and a dozen rye whiskeys, and then did our analysis to see can we tell them apart chemically. And I think the profiling paper that talks about bourbon, Tennessee, and rye whiskeys shows that when you look at the non-volatile composition, so non-volatile means things that we're not smelling. So the things that make it smell the way they do are the volatile compounds. Those are the things that we can actually smell with our noses. Non-volatile composition refers to things like some of these oak-related compounds that get extracted during barrel aging, but contribute to color, they contribute to mouthfeel, they contribute to, in some cases, to aroma, but not entirely. And so we were using the LC QTOF to do the analysis of the compounds that are extracted into these whiskeys. And what you can see in that profiling is,
before you go too crazy, what's an LC QTOF?
So the LC is the HPLC. That's the liquid chromatography quadrupole time of flight mass spec. So that's the instrument that we're using to do the analysis. So the LC part separates the individual compounds based on how they interact with the chromatography column. And then as they come out of the LC, they're introduced to the mass spec. And the mass spec separates whatever's coming out at that time. It separates them by mass, so how heavy the compounds are. And because it's a quadrupole time of flight, we get really good mass resolution. So we can separate things that are pretty similar to one another. And it also gives us an estimation of what the chemical formula is so that we can then really get a leg up on identifying specific compounds that are involved. And when we look at these kind of compounds extracted from oak, there's not surprisingly a lot of overlap, because bourbons and ryes, generally speaking, are aged in very similar new charred casks. And so you're going to extract a lot of the same things, irrespective of what whiskey you're putting into it. And so bourbons and ryes aged in new casks, for example, look very different than Scotch whiskeys aged in reused casks, because we've extracted a lot of things in the first use, and there's not as much left to extract in subsequent uses.
Can you like without, because of course we can't do it visually, but can you explain really how they are? You know, if you were to look at something, like how does it look that they're actually different on paper?
So there's several different ways we can do it. One of them is just to look at individual compounds and just measure the abundance or concentration of these individual compounds in the different whiskey types. And when you do that, there's a lot of variability. And bourbons and ryes, generally, the concentrations don't vary that much for things like glycol, for some of the oak-related tannins that get extracted, for any of the things that we're looking at using the LC-Q-TOF. They generally look pretty similar. We don't see a lot of separation. We do sometimes see separation by producer because they're using specific cooperages, so that sort of points to maybe differences that are related to the barrels and not so much differences between the spirits.
What are some of those differences? Like, what are the actual compounds that you're seeing that are either higher or lower in rye versus bourbon and stuff?
If you're anything like me, then you can't get enough about bourbon. And that's why I'm a subscriber to Bourbon Plus magazine. Bourbon Plus is a quarterly publication that tells the stories from the heart of bourbon, the farmers who grow the grain, the distillers who labor over the process, and the people like you and me who raise their glasses to celebrate it all. Subscribe to Bourbon Plus magazine today at bourbonplus.com, that's PLUS.com, and use code PURSUIT at checkout for $5 off your subscription. Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify's point of sale is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. And with Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Connect with customers in line and online. Shopify helps you drive store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns, from TikTok to Instagram and beyond. And get hardware that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone. Transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system or use Shopify's point-of-sale Go mobile device for a battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/bourbon, all lowercase, and go to shopify.com/bourbon to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/bourbon.
What are some of those differences? Like, what are the actual compounds that you're seeing that are either higher or lower in rye versus bourbon and stuff?
Well, so when we look at the oak-related compounds, we're looking at things like glycol and eugenol, and we're looking at some of the wood tannins. We're looking at phenylpropanoids, things like kumaric acid and syringol and syringic acid, things that are oak. They're extracted from oak. We do. So there were several things. One is we didn't see big differences between bourbon and rye. We do see some differences between younger whiskeys and older whiskeys in terms of the kinds of compounds that are extracted. We tend to see simpler wood-related compounds, monomers, so things just like the kumaric acid, syringic acid, ferulic acid, that are extracted in younger whiskeys. And then as you get to older whiskeys, you start to see more tannin, you start to see dimers and bigger sort of, not quite tannins, but somewhere between the simple monomers and the tannins, you see these smaller complexes of oak-related compounds. So lignans, things like syringoresinol and leonoresinol, things that are more complicated, probably take more time to extract. We also see a number of triterpenoid compounds that are extracted into the whiskeys. And again, the longer the whiskey is aged, the more of these things you get extracted. And then the other class of compounds that you see are lipids, so fatty acid kinds of compounds that become more oxidized as the whiskey spends more time in barrel. So there's things that sort of make sense. You're going to have more oxidation the longer you're in the barrel, and that's going to be reflected in the profile of the lipids in the whiskey as well. So what we were seeing was more difference between younger whiskeys and older whiskeys, not big differences between bourbons and ryes.
I'm looking at this table too, and with bourbon whiskeys, it seems like there's more differentiation compounds in the bourbon whiskeys than any other. Is that correct? Am I reading that right?
Yes, you're reading that right. And I think in part it had to do with availability of whiskeys at the time we did this study. So when we were doing this, you could find a broader range of ages of bourbons than you could for ryes. This was during that period of time when rye whiskeys were, when it was hard to find older rye whiskeys. And so most of the rye whiskeys we looked at were younger whiskeys, whereas the bourbons, we had a full range. And so I think part of the reason there were more compounds in the bourbon that differentiated the bourbon than rye was we just had a more diverse set of bourbons than we did for ryes in that first study.
Gotcha. I thought it was just proving that bourbon is king to everything. It has more.
We could go with
it has
that.
More different. Yeah,
I'm okay with that.
That's my hypothesis.
Well, now that there are older rye whiskeys available again, we could go back and repeat the study and see if we get similar outcomes.
I'm in on that.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll use Kenny's bar.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at again at this table and kind of let's talk about some of these dihydroxybenzenol idle. I can't even try.
Dihydroxybenzaldehyde?
Yeah,
We'll go with that.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for saving me there.
Yep.
Kind of talk about what each one of these are really contributing to the bourbon itself too.
Well, so I would say the first thing is we don't necessarily know what all of these compounds are doing in terms of their effects on the aroma. So that dihydroxybenzaldehyde is likely a breakdown product from lignin, and it's produced during the toasting / in this case, charring process from the degradation of the lignin that's in the wood. It's probably got, if I had to guess, it's some sort of a medicinal, maybe spicy kind of aroma.
Nice.
And so it's going to be related to things like guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol.
All right. What about octanic acid?
So that's one of the lipids. So octanoic acid is a short chain, so it's 8 carbon lipid. That's probably coming from one of the younger whiskeys, I'm thinking.
Maybe.
And then as you get, so you're going to see between 8 and 12, 16 carbon chains are pretty typical for what we see in these products. And then as the whiskey ages, you'll start to see things like hydroxyoctanoic acid or dihydroxyoctanoic acid. So you'll have more oxygen incorporated just as those lipids get oxidized. And that's going to might affect maybe to a small extent, the oiliness. It's going to give you some slightly different aromas, particularly if you start to get a lot of the oxidized lipids present. You start to get into what in cognac would be called the rancio character. So that sort of character of oxidized lipids.
Gotcha. So Ryan, if you're keeping track here, I'm 0 for 2 on pronouncing these correctly. But
well, I'm not even trying, so I can.
I appreciate the effort, right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have to do the next one or the next two because vanillin and vanillic acid, vanilla, right? I mean, unless there's something crazy I don't know about vanilla, you can school us on that.
No, you're dead on there.
Yep. All right. Then there's decanoic acid.
Yeah, decanoic acid. Good. So that's the 10 carbon. That's the 10 carbon chain. So you had octanoic.
I know that one. No, I'm kidding.
And then dodecanoic would be the 12, and then you get into the longer chain ones. But those are part from the wood, part from yeast metabolism.
Cool. Esculitin. How about that one?
That's a wood related. That's one of the compounds that's. It's derived from the wood. It's a lignin degradation product as well. I don't know what specific character it would have, but it's going to be part of that set of volatile phenols that are products of degradation of the wood. So we see similar things in wine as well.
All right. We got 3 more to go here, Ryan. So we got ellagic acid or ellagic.
Ellagic. Yep.
All right. Ellagic.
So
Good old ellagic.
You got old ellagic. Yep.
Ellagic acid is a breakdown product from wood tannin. So when you heat wood, the ellagic tannins break down to ellagic acid and then ultimately to gallic acid. So it might contribute some bitterness when it's before it's broken down. When it's still a wood tannin, it's going to give you some astringency, some coarseness, some of that woodiness that you sometimes get in bourbons that may have been in barrel a little too long.
Awesome. All right. So we got heptamethoxyflavonoid.
Oh, heptamethoxyflavonoid. That's one I'm not really sure what that does.
I'd say we stuffed the chump, but man alive, there's no way that would happen today. And
a common theme, though, I will notice with this is that you keep saying wood. And so I guess it just proves that 70% of the flavor comes from the wood.
Yeah, there's some significant percentage of the flavor is wood derived, and flavor and a lot of the aromas are wood derived. So that was part of what we're trying to understand is just how critical is wood to the character of these products. And you would guess going in that it would be, and it is. Now, in terms of the aroma, we didn't in this study look at using gas chromatography, so a way to look at the volatile compounds, because you do have different characters in rye and bourbon in the aroma, and those are not going to be necessarily wood related compounds. There are going to be some volatile aroma compounds that are related to the mash bill, and that's something that we have looked at in a subsequent paper where we worked with a distiller to produce whiskeys with different mash bills, different amounts of corn and rye, so that we could try and understand that part of the problem better, that part of the equation. But one of the difficulties we have in this kind of work is, as researchers, we don't have access to what the mash bills are that any of these distillers are producing, and that's fine. So we have to make some estimation about what they're doing, but then we worked with a distiller to actually produce whiskeys of the mash bills that we wanted to try.
Mm. And so,
what kind of budget did they give you to go buy these bottles? Were they like, here's how much you got to spend?
The money we used for this came from bits and pieces of startup funds, different sources. Some of it came from our own pockets, just because we wanted to do this work and we were interested in it, and we really weren't sure where to turn to get funding to support this kind of work.
There you go, Ryan.
Yep, Kickstarter, Kickstarter.
Yeah, well, that's we've kicked that idea around of doing a Kickstarter to try and get funding to do some of these projects, just because it takes money to do this analysis, and some of it comes from various startup funds and things that we have a little more control over what we can spend the money on. So
I'm
in for $10.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate
me in. I'll give you 100. I'm not cheap like Kenny. So I have a question. One thing sometimes you get into whiskey is like real fruity notes. What are those compounds that are bringing that out?
Well, some of those are ethyl esters of some of these fatty acids. Typically, those are the fruity compounds that we see in wine are higher alcohols that are produced during fermentation. And then with the amount of ethanol that's around, you get a combination of the fatty acid and the ethanol to produce an ethyl ester. And many of the ethyl esters have these fruity aromas.
Yeah. So while we kind of move on, I've got a lot of questions that have been coming in through our live chat through here. So I kind of want to get to some of these because there's some good ones here. And
where's
curious,
the live chat?
Yeah, I'll send you the link here. So so as we kind of go through here, there's a really good one, and it's kind of talking about barrel entry proof. And I'm not too sure if you've done any research on that. And this one might just be your best estimate or guess of knowledge here. But Can you talk about barrel entry proof and the effect it would have on the solubility of the compounds that are pulled from the barrel? Because many people claim that a lower entry proof like 107 or 110 results in a better whiskey rather than putting in at something like the max capacity at 125.
Sure. So the first thing is we haven't done that sort of research yet, although that's something I'm interested in doing. The whole reason we started down this path of looking at distilled spirits was just to get a wildly different entry proof from what we were doing with wine. Wine, we're at 15% alcohol. If you're at 125, you're 62.5. So it's a completely different solvent system. You have so much more ethanol, it's going to affect what gets extracted from the wood. And so we definitely see, if you compare wine and spirits, you will see very different things extracted because ethanol is a really strong solvent. That's the difference between 15 and 60, 62.5. You won't see as wildly different outcomes if you're looking at 110 versus 125. So there'll be some differences. That's still a significantly higher level of ethanol, but it's not going to be as different as what we see between wine and spirits. The higher the alcohol, the higher the ethanol level, the higher the proof, the more organic compounds you'll be able to extract. You should extract more at higher proof than at lower proof. Mm-hmm. But you're going to extract different things as well. And so it's one of the things that we want to do. You're going to see a different set of extraction. You're going to see probably more of the triterpenoids. You're going to see more of the lipids extracted at higher proof than at lower. But I don't know yet to what extent that would have, what impact that would have on the whiskey itself.
Yeah, it kind of reaffirms there was an assumption in the chat that said somebody that took a few classes over at Independent Stave, and they at least Independent Stave said they did some data and did some analysis and said that barrel entry proof of 114 produces the most flavor compounds, and they have the data to back that up, whereas something that can be higher can sometimes extract more of the undesirable compounds that are coming from the wood.
Exactly. You're definitely going to extract different things at 125 than you would at 110. You're going to extract a lot of it's going to be very similar, but you have the opportunity to extract some other things at higher proof that may or may not be desirable. You may get better outcomes at lower. We just haven't done the work. We haven't had the opportunity. We haven't had access to the whiskeys to be able to do that. We are starting to work with a local distiller here to go down these rabbit holes to see what there is to see.
We got whiskey. We can help you out. You just let us know when you need samples.
Good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And another kind of thing that came up, people were kind of wondering, and I think you kind of talked about it a little bit about not really being able to discern a whole lot of difference between rye and bourbon based on their mash bill from a scientific level. But I mean, something that's like a wheated bourbon versus a rye bourbon. Were you able to find any discernible differences between those, or is it at the end of it, it doesn't look any different in science?
Well, so some of it comes down to the tools we're using. So when we use the LC QTOF and we're looking at non-volatile compounds, that's a good tool for looking at situations where you have different kinds of barrels, because it's a really good tool for looking at what you're extracting from the barrel. And so we can really easily see differences between bourbons, ryes, and Scotch whiskeys or Irish whiskeys, things that are aged in used barrels. That's really straightforward. To see differences in mash bill, we need to look at the volatile profile. So we need to use gas chromatography instead. And in this most recent study, we've started to use that as a tool. And then we are able to see more differences based on mash bill. We haven't, with that, yet looked at rye versus wheated bourbons, but that's on the list of things to do. The other thing I would say is using the LCQ TOF, we can differentiate between whiskeys of different ages because a lot of those differences are related to what's being extracted from the barrel. We can see some differences between producers based on the barrels that they're using. And so it's a tool that could be used for things like, is this whiskey really what it says it is in terms of age or producer? I think with some work and with the right set of library standards, we could start to use this as a tool for authentication in case there was some concern about a whiskey being what the label says it is. We're not there yet, but I think it's a tool we could use for that. The Scotch regulatory agencies are using these kinds of tools to verify authenticity of Scotch whiskeys, for example.
Do you think that you could look at, whether you're using gas chromatography or HPLC or anything like that, to sit there and look at, and I don't know if you're this deep into the bourbon world, with Dusties or basically bourbons that were from the 60s, 70s and stuff like that versus what's produced today? I mean, do you have any hypothesis on kind of what that would look like?
Well,
a lot of oxygen.
Well, oxygen would certainly be one of the key things to be concerned about it. But assuming that the package was well sealed and you're not getting a lot of oxygen into the older whiskey, it could be a tool to go back and look at. Well, for example, the question of entry proof, because you go back to a certain time, 110 was more common than where we're at now. So there may be possibilities to look at that. It's also, a tool to look at differences in production practices as well. Some of that would be gas chromatography. Some of it would be liquid chromatography. It's something we are interested in doing. Getting access to those kind of samples is not always easy, but we've had some discussions about doing that kind of work.
You need to do it with Jack Rose and just go through their whiskey collection, do their research.
Yeah, I'm sure Bill Thomas would love that. Yeah,
all for science.
All in the name of research. That's how
it's science.
Yeah, absolutely.
Life's too short to make bad bourbon too.
Yeah. There we go, Ryan. We're gonna sell license plate holders with that on it now.
That's right.
So we're kind of creeping up to the top of the hour here, and I kind of want to finish this on a strong note. Is there one thing that you took away from a lot of this research that the average Joe can make a better informed or buying decision or anything like that, or like what's a big takeaway from everything that you've been doing here?
Well, I think we touched on it a little while ago that it's a pretty large percentage of the aroma and flavor in distilled spirits comes from the cask that it's stored in. With bourbon, we definitely see some differences between producers. We definitely see differences in the age of the whiskey, and there's some really, it's, as you say, the more you know, the better you're going to be. And it's interesting just to see how these things play out as you look at younger versus older whiskeys. And a fair amount of this work has been done during the period of time when the industry was sort of scrambling to have enough older bourbons, older ryes for the marketplace. There was a lot of demand. And so it's, some of this is, you can see some of that challenge in the results that we're looking at in terms of being able to maintain the age of the products that they're putting on the marketplace.
Fantastic. And I guess I got one more question that came into the chat because sure. It's really going to marry your two worlds here, right? So what about when a whiskey is aged in a secondary cask, like a wine or a port casks, like Angel's Envy and some other ones that are out there? Is there a type of chemical reaction that's happening with this blend? Kind of give us your kind of take on that.
We definitely didn't really touch on this because it was more in the Scotch world, but and when you're looking at scotches, there's this big differentiation between scotches that have been aged in ex-bourbon barrels versus sherry butts. And we can pick those out night versus day. The ones that have aged in sherry casks look very different from the ones that have been aged in bourbon casks. And I would expect we'd see the same sort of thing if you started looking at other whiskeys that have been finished in port barrels or Zinfandel barrels or Pinot Noir barrels or whatever other kinds of things that are out there. You would see the influence of that other product as well. Some of it is direct influence from the product itself, so the port or the Zinfandel, but some of it is also just differences in the wood. You're going to see some differences because of toasted wood versus charred wood. There are definitely things to see. And we can also, I think, see when we're looking at the sherry casks, we can see differences not just between sherry and bourbon, but between Spanish oak sherry casks and American oak sherry casks. So there are definitely characteristics of the wood that shine through in spite of the influence of the sherry too.
It all comes back to the wood.
It all comes back to the wood.
There we go.
I think our conclusion is that we need barrel statements instead of age statements, like what barrel was in, the char level, how long,
Sure.
I think that's the conclusion.
It all comes back to the wood.
Yep.
Well, this was fantastic. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show today and really, like I said, schooling us. I've fumbled on more words than I have, I think, in a long time, trying to get them out here and really, educating our listeners and for us, for myself, I think this was super interesting just to kind of see this from a data perspective.
Sure.
In my business, we always say that the data never lies. And so when you look at it of really what is being influenced to the whiskey via, as we just said, all comes back to the wood. It's super interesting in my opinion when we see this. But I also want to let you give an opportunity to plug where people can either find out more about you or research any more about you or look at some of your papers. And if we're going to look after this, so hopefully we'll get some thumbs up and green lights and you'll be able to find some of these papers on our website when this podcast is aired. So go ahead and give yourself a plug there too.
Well, first of all, it's absolutely been my pleasure to do this. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about some of this work. And I'm glad to see there's interest in this sort of thing because it can get pretty dry and academic at times. So
I feel like you're just like yelling in a cave. Like
good to break it down and talk to folks who are passionate about it and appreciate what the implications for some of this might be. So I really appreciate it. And again, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, some of it is posted at the Washington State University Department or Viticulture and Enology Program website. You can Google that and it'll pop up and you'll be able to find me somewhere on that webpage. So happy to answer questions that people might have as well.
You got it. All right.
Very cool.
If you got questions, start Googling and good luck.
And good luck.
But seriously, thank you again for coming on the show. So reach out. You can try to find Tom out there. You can always reach out to us too, team@bourbonpursuit.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to see what we're drinking, what we're talking about, where we are today. And if you like the show and you want to help it grow, we would appreciate it. Write a review. And if you even want to be part of these, as I'd mentioned, you get to be here during the live chat. You can support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. Ryan, go ahead and close us out.
Yeah, Tom, thanks, man. That was enjoyable. I was trying to wrap my head around these concepts and try to talk intelligently about it. Yeah, I think, science, you try to do something so you can replicate it and, have something that's proven. And I think time and time again with spirits and bourbon, you just can't replace that human element. And there's so many variables with, nature and then the human element of making a consistent product. So it's interesting. And I hope there's more continued research about it because it is fascinating.
All right. Terrific. I enjoyed it immensely. And thanks for the interest. And yeah, absolutely. The human element is a huge part of it. And a lot of this was really focused on what are the things that matter, what are the things that the human element can focus on to get a better outcome.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right. Cheers, everybody.